6:50 a.m. Tuesday. Cripes, Sarge! Look out! Homer Tubman whirled at Patrolman Jenkins' warning and stared with disbelief at the wall of water rushing toward them. "Levee's gone!" he shouted. "Run for it!" They ran west in the middle of Cedar Street, the sergeant quickly taking a good lead, but they'd hardly gone a quarter of a block when the 6-foot avalanche of water smashed into them, bowling them over and carrying them along nearly twice as fast as they'd been running. They lost contact with one another, and each fought desperately to save his own life in the churning maelstrom. 4 blocks from where the wave had scooped them up, Tupman was tossed into the low branches of a tree and managed to get a good hold. An instant later, he saw Jenkins coming along the same line he had floated, and he snatched the man's hand as he too hit the tree. In a moment, both of them were perched well above the water. They climbed to the top, where cables dipped through the branches midway between 2 telegraph poles, and from here they swung themselves hand over hand to the first pole, and then walked along the wires for 4 blocks before reaching dry ground, where they could alight and continue their work. "You know something, Sarge?" Jenkins panted. "This is one hell of a lousy job we've got." 6:58 a.m. Tuesday. There were 3 customers at the counter in Saddles when Mary Shunk walked in at a couple of minutes to 7. All of them were men. "Ah, good morning, Mary," said Ollie Saddle, beaming. "Today you are on time, eh?" His eyes twinkled merrily. "He looks like Santa Claus without whiskers when he smiles like that," Mary thought. "Such a nice old man." She smiled brightly at him, closed her umbrella, and shook it out the door, then reopened it and stood it in the corner to dry. She hung her coat on a rack, stuffed her headscarf in the pocket, and shook her head to fluff her hair. She had long black curls that hung from the back of her head like soft, glossy springs, catching the light in little squiggly highlights. The customers were watching her appreciatively, and Mary pretended she was unaware of this. It delighted her that after being married for 6 years, she still attracted the attention of men. The old man shook his head and put his hands to his ears in an exaggerated gesture. "Oh, those whistles! I was so glad when they stopped. They blew for nearly an hour. Did you talk to Eddie, Mary? Did he say why they were blowing?" She nodded. "He called me, said the rivers were almost to the tops of the levees, and there was going to be flooding in the low spots. They're blowing them as a warning." Saddle frowned. "Not a flood like in '66, I hope." He put a palm to his cheek and widened his eyes. "Now that was a bad flood. The water right out in front here was 2 feet deep, and downtown it was 4. It was a hard time for everyone then. I would not like to see that happen again. Such a mess." The customers had been following the exchange with interest. One of them, a youth in his late teens, suffering badly from acne, looked at Mary eagerly. "Any chance the levees'll bust?" "Well, I certainly hope not," she answered sharply. "That would be awful." "Yeah," the young man said enthusiastically. "Yeah, it sure would, wouldn't it? Golly, it sure would be something." "I ain't much of a swimmer," another of the men said. He was a husky individual in soiled work clothes and wearing a very dirty small-billed Cap. Fact is, I don't much cotton to water at all. Far as I'm concerned, it can just stay in the river where it ought to be. His companion took a big bite from a fresh doughnut and nodded his head in agreement. I don't think it'll flood much, Saddle said to no one in particular. In '66 I was a young man then. It rained much harder here than it has this time. Much harder. He peered out of the big window and thought about that flood of 47 years past. His cousin had contracted pneumonia because of it and died in 4 days. It had been a sad time, and he thought of things he hadn't brought to mind for years. The thoughts caused his eyes to burn and a lump to form in his throat. Behind him he heard Mary making a new pot of coffee and was about to return to the counter when 3 automobiles in a row rattled past, traveling quite fast. In the first, there were only 2 men, but the second and third were filled with people, and men were hanging onto the running boards on both sides of each. Huh? Saddle, wiping his hands on his apron, opened the door and watched the cars go up Fairgrounds Hill and disappear over the top, heading toward NCR. Huh? He repeated. Now that is a very funny thing. Another car came by, equally crowded, and this time followed by a horse-drawn wagon at a full gallop. He turned and looked toward downtown and saw 2 more wagons approaching and a man in a business suit incongruously riding bareback on a horse. He shouted at Ollie Saddle, slowing only a little and pointing back toward downtown before continuing toward the hill. 3 blocks north, where the canal went past just before the downtown district, Saddle could see a sea of water across the street. It looked as if the canal might be leaving its banks. He watched a horse pulling a buggy gingerly crossing the canal bridge, and the horse was just to the top. Oh, and the water was just to the tops of the horse's hooves. The proprietor re-entered his shop. People, he said seriously, I'm afraid we may get a little wet. The water is coming down the main street toward us. The man on horseback told me that the levee is broken just east of Main on Monument Avenue. Hey, cried the pimpled youth. You mean it? It's really busted? Golly! I wish I could have seen it. He leaped up and ran to the door to look out. There was disappointment in his face when he came back. Hardly even cover in the street up that way, he grumbled. Not even up on the sidewalks. It'd have to go up a whole foot or more, probably, before it even reached here. Well, one thing, anyways, I guess I won't have to go to work today. You can give me another cup of coffee. He squeezed a pimple on his chin and wiped his fingers on his trousers. Guess you can give me a couple more of them sugar donuts, too. Ollie Saddle looked at the young man and shook his head sadly. He filled the cup and put 2 more donuts on the plate. He had just had a premonition, a decidedly unpleasant one, of his own. I think, he said slowly, you will see much more water than you want to see. He shook his head again and spoke more to himself than to anyone present. Much more water.